I don't always have a good idea of what I'm going to talk about until the camera is turned on, and that's the case today. But a brother posted a comment on my forum today at ejehovahswitnesses.com. He and his wife had been in the truth for many years. He had served as an elder for 40 years. That's a long time. But they no longer are associated with their congregation. And so he sent out an email to some friends and all the elders explaining why they were no longer associated. He didn't post the letter, only the response. But he did mention that some of their issues were the governing body's advocacy of the mRNA vaccines and the Watchtower's secret 10-year partnership with the United Nations and the deplorable way in which the Watchtower has handled the child abuse situation over many decades. Well, that was a lot for them to chew on, but, you know, I know the reaction because I've been through this as well. 20-some years ago, I sat through the whole thing, 19 years ago actually, and the response was very similar. The issues brought up are not discussed. They can't be, because elders are not in a position to know all the facts unless they themselves have delved into it. And if they have, then they may not be elders either. They might step down in disgust. But the whole issue is you're speaking against Jehovah's faithful slave. And the unmentioned implication is they cannot be wrong. They can do no wrong. Oh, sure, they're not inspired. They're not infallible. They're imperfect men. But they couldn't do those wicked things that you say they've done. Really. So I thought I would talk about the faithful and discreet slave. And this has been a topic for many of my essays on ewatchman.com and commentaries on the forum. Excuse me. The mosquitoes are really out. They are out, heavy swarms of them. Anyway, Jesus, for one thing, let's get this out of the way. Jesus did not appoint a faithful and discreet slave. There are two appointments. Jesus appoints a slave with an assignment to feed his sheep, feed his domestics. And that's always been the assignment for everyone in Jehovah's organization going back to the first century. What did Jesus tell Peter on the beach there? Do you love me, Peter? Yes, Lord, I love you. Feed my little sheep. Do you love me, Peter? Yes, you know I do. Feed my little lambs. So Paul explained to the Corinthians that he said it's a trivial matter for me to be, examined by you or a tribunal. He goes, I don't even examine myself. But what is looked for is for a steward to be faithful, to be found faithful by Jehovah. And so that's the whole point with Jesus appointing a slave, a group of men given responsibility. And Jesus said, happy is that slave if, when his master comes, he finds him doing so. However, what about if he doesn't find him doing so? Well, the governing body says, oh, that's just a hypothetical. Well, no, it's not. And we can prove that it's not by Jesus' own words. When Jesus comes, there will be slaves who are approved and appointed over all the master's belongings, and there will be slaves who are found to be wicked and who will be punished with the greatest severity and put out. But until Jesus comes, those two slaves are in the same household. And really, this goes back to the parable that Jesus gave in the 13th chapter of Matthew about the wheat and the weeds. Well, the Watchtower said, well, the weeds are the parishioners of Christendom, and they were uprooted back in 1918, and the wheat were put into the storehouse. The true sons of the kingdom have been shining like the sun. Yeah. Well, why would God need to separate the wheat and the weeds if the Bible students were already a separate and distinct sect, which they were, and then you had all the other religions of Christendom? Where did God separate them out from? It doesn't work that way. You know, Paul tried to explain to the Corinthians that these men whom they thought were outstanding orators, apparently, and Paul snidely referred to them as a superfine apostles, he said that they were actually disguised agents of Satan. They only pretended to be ministers of righteousness. And he says it's nothing for them to do that because Satan himself disguises himself as an angel of light. So this mentality that has been cultivated among Jehovah's Witnesses is that everyone in the organization is in a safe place. They're in spiritual paradise, and they cannot be influenced by Satan because Satan is out there. But that wasn't the case with the anointed Christian congregation, was it? No, if you read that second letter, the 11th chapter, Paul said that he was worried about them. He was concerned that they might be seduced, just like the devil, using a serpent, seduced Eve. He said, your minds and hearts might be corrupted away from the Christ. And then he went on to talk about these superfine apostles. So that was the spiritual danger that they were facing. It wasn't on the outside. It was on the inside. But of course, the Watchtower says those superfine apostles, they're like the clergy. So everything has been explained away. And that's very clever. That's what Satan does, right? He disguises himself as an angel of light. Well, Jehovah allowed those superfine apostles to be in Christ's congregation. Why would it change now? What has changed? Well, nothing has changed. But to get back to that point about there being, ultimately, there will be a faithful slave and a wicked slave, two different factions with two very different destinies. I would advise you to turn to the 12th chapter of Luke. It's a rather long chapter. And so much of what Jesus said, we tend to think, well, that applied in the first century. And maybe in principle, it applies secondarily to us in some way. But you know, the Apostle Paul spoke of himself as living during the time of Christ's return. He said, we the living who survive to the presence of the Lord shall in no way precede those who have fallen asleep in death. So Jesus does the same thing. But beginning in really the first verse of the 12th chapter, Jesus said, watch out for the leaven of the Pharisees, which is hypocrisy. Now here's a very important principle. But there is nothing carefully concealed that will not be revealed, and nothing secret that will not become known. Therefore, whatever you say in the darkness will be heard in the light, and what you whisper in private rooms will be preached from the housetops. Well, Has the watchtower anything to hide? Well, very much. So many of Jehovah's Witnesses, when they hear about this secret partnership with, they never heard about that. That can't be true. Well, it is true. It's not widely known, apparently, because Jehovah's Witnesses just cannot accept it. It is mind-blowing. But I spent hours and hours. I'd be embarrassed to tell you how many hours I spent researching this. But it's still, for the most part, concealed. But when Christ comes, what else is going to be revealed when Christ comes? The man of lawlessness. And do you think there might be a connection there? Yeah. Anyway, Jesus goes on. He's speaking to his little flock. He tells them to have no fear. And then he says, down in verse 11, when they bring you in before public assemblies, government officials, and authorities, do not become anxious about how or what you will speak in defense or what you will say. For the Holy Spirit will teach you in that very hour the things you should say. Well, there's no evidence, really, that large numbers of those original Christians were hauled before assemblies and governors and kings. Jesus, of course, stood before Pilate and Herod, and so did Paul. Paul asked to have his case brought before Caesar, and he was shipped to Rome. But we don't know how many others. But in that very same book of Luke, when Jesus was discussing the conclusion, he reiterated this and said, you will be brought before governors and kings to give them a witness. Now, this is about during the tribulation, right? After the tribulation, to be more correct. So keep that in mind, that Jesus is really speaking to us living now. So he goes on to encourage his little flock. And in verse 35, be dressed and ready, and have your lamps burning. And you should be like men waiting for their master to return from the marriage, so that when he comes and knocks, they may at once open to him. Happy are those slaves whom the master on coming finds watching. Truly, I say to you, he will dress himself for service and have them recline at the table and come alongside and minister to them. And if he comes in the second watch, even if in the third, and finds them ready, happy they are. But know this, if the householder had known at what hour the thief would come, he would not have let his house be broken into. You also keep ready, because at an hour that you do not think likely, the Son of Man is coming. Well, you likely recognize that Jesus used those very same words, the very same illustration of him coming as a thief when he was speaking about the faithful and discreet slave. When he asked the question, who really is the faithful and discreet slave? And then the caveat was, the warning, if the master finds you watching and ready. I know I pointed this out before, but I can't believe no one has ever really accepted this or caught it or explained it. But when Jesus said that he will dress himself for service, not field service, mind you, but as a servant. Imagine that, Jesus is your servant. And it says he will come alongside and minister to them reclining at the table. Well, isn't that what Jesus did during the evening meal? After the evening meal, he got up and girded himself as a slave and washed the feet of the apostles. So, but this expression, when he comes alongside, he will have them recline at the table and will come alongside. What does the word parousia mean? Come alongside, to be alongside. So Jesus said he would be with his disciples all the days until the conclusion. And here at the conclusion is when he comes knocking. And if he finds them ready, he will come in. That's something special. Imagine opening the door, literally open the door, and there's Jesus. Come in? Oh, what do you want? Who are you? But if you open the door and Jesus comes in, you're good, because he's going to minister to you and fill you with all his fullness. That's what the sealing is. That's what happens to those who are found ready and waiting. They become the brothers of Christ. And the weeds are put out, bound up, put in the fire, and the wheat is gathered into the storehouse. And Jesus said they would shine as brightly as the sun in the kingdom of their Father. You'd shine pretty brightly if you saw Jesus in his glory. He's not going to be walking around in a robe and sandals, all that. No, the manifestation of Christ is a manifestation of his glory as he exists in the spirit realm. Paul had a glimpse of it, didn't he, on the road to Damascus? Saul, I should say. Blown off his feet, literally. Well, now Peter, he always had something to say. Jesus said, keep ready, because at an hour you do not think likely the Son of Man is coming. Then Peter said, Lord, are you telling this illustration just to us, or also to everyone? Good question. And Jesus said, who really is the faithful steward, the discreet one, whom his master will appoint over his body of attendants to keep giving them their measure of food supplies at the proper time? So he answered Peter's question with a question. Okay, so, and then he goes and reiterates basically what he said in Matthew. But then he gave a more severe warning that if he should ever say, my master delays, and that's not going to turn out well for him. But then in verse 47, now this is the point. Then that slave who understood the will of, who understood the will of his master, but did not get ready or to do what he asked, will be beaten with many strokes. But the one who did not understand and yet did things deserving of strokes will be beaten with a few. Indeed, everyone to whom much was given, much will be demanded of him. And the one who was put in charge of much will have more than usual demanded of him. So there's two outcomes. Both slaves get beaten. The only difference is the degree of punishment based upon their accountability. One knew the will of the master, but was deliberately disobedient. The other was ignorant. So there's a difference in motive there, isn't there? One is beaten severely, and one receives a few strokes. And as it says in Jeremiah, Jehovah said, I will not exterminate you, but I will have to discipline you to the proper degree. Well, the slave that is beaten with many strokes, that ain't good, because he doesn't recover. He's put out, thrown into the outer darkness, and he weeps and gnashes his teeth, knowing he has been condemned to everlasting death for apostasy, for rebellion, for opposing Christ. That's the man of lawlessness. So, getting back to our friend who submitted this letter, and by the way, he he explained that before the day was out, the elders who received his email sent emails out to all the friends saying, do not open Brother so-and-so's email. Delete it. Get it off your computer. Because they had no answer. They can't defend the Watchtower. They were appointed by the Watchtower to defend the Watchtower as far as, just towing the company line, you might say. So, but for the elders who think their job is to defend this faithful slave, he can do no wrong, well, the only question is the slave willfully ignorant, or are they deliberately denying the truth, defying the will of God? Those are the only two outcomes. And of course, Paul, when he was talking about, it's a trivial thing for him to be examined by men or a tribunal, he says, therefore, do not judge until the Lord comes, and he will bring everything to light. Isn't that what Jesus said in opening the discussion there in the 12th chapter of Luke? Nothing concealed will not be revealed when the Lord comes. Jesus in Revelation, he's depicted as having fiery eyes. He can see into the darkness. X-ray vision, you might say, like Superman, right? No, but it's hard for Jehovah's Witnesses who have been conditioned to accept the fact that the Watchtower has betrayed them. And maybe it might ease the burden. They betrayed Jehovah. They betrayed Jesus. They've denied the truth. I mean, that's why this NGO partnership with the UN is so unbelievable, because everyone knows the Watchtower has identified the United Nations as the image of the wild beast, the scarlet-colored beast. And here they agreed to disseminate literature with a positive spin for the United Nations. And I've documented pretty extensively how they did that in the book Jehovah Himself Has Become King. There's a whole chapter. So I'd like to take you to another prophetic book, the 6th chapter of Jeremiah. And Jeremiah was warning the Jews that a great disaster was coming down from the north, from out of the north. Sort of like the king of the north, right? Only in this instance, the coming tempest of Jehovah was in the form of the Babylonian armies. Well, the Jews may have felt pretty confident, because when Assyria came to conquer, they took some of the cities in the surrounding area of Judah, and they came up against Jerusalem, and Jehovah's angel went out and liquidated the entire Assyrian army. So here comes the Babylonian army. And no doubt many of them felt like Jehovah, he'll take care of us again. But it didn't work that way, did it? So Jeremiah tells them in verse 4, prepare for war against her. Rise up and let us attack her at midday. Woe to us, for the day is declining, for the shadows of evening are getting longer. Yeah. Now, verse 8, be warned, O Jerusalem, or I will turn away from you in disgust. I will make you desolate, a land without inhabitants. But then in verse 9, he says, they will thoroughly glean the remnant of Israel as the last grapes on the vine. Pass your hand again, like one gathering grapes from the vine. Well, when we read Jesus' words about the conclusion of the system of things, about his coming and his presence, we might say the central feature of his prophecy was what? The desolation of Jerusalem. Well, recently the Watchtower said that Jerusalem in the Hebrew prophecies, such as in Jeremiah and Ezekiel, we used to think that that foreshadowed Christendom. But we don't think that anymore. Okay, so what does ancient Jerusalem typify? They don't say. Well, what does Jerusalem typify or represent that Jesus is talking about that would be desolated by a disgusting thing? He said, when you see the disgusting thing standing where it ought not, standing in a holy place, one gospel says. Well, Christians are to respond in a certain way. That's Jesus giving life-saving instructions. But the Watchtower says it will give. Well, why do we need that? Jesus has already given them. When you see this disgusting thing, what is the disgusting thing? You know, I think the Watchtower has it right. It's the United Nations. But not the United Nations now. The United Nations that will be in the future when it becomes a world government. Before that can happen, the nations have to be destroyed. Not their populations, but the nation-state system that gives them sovereignty. If you've been keeping up with current events, the WHO, not the rock band, the World Health Organization is lobbying strong to have absolute authority for the next pandemic so that it will have authority over national governments. It will be able to issue lockdown orders that cannot be revoked by local authorities or national governments. So that's where we're going with this. And I've talked about this in many venues. The nation-state system, America, is going down. It's in the process now of being taken down, bankrupted, driven into senseless wars. I'm not going to go there, but this prophecy about gleaning the remnant of Israel, could that be the anointed remnant of spiritual Israel? It is gleaned after this Jerusalem is made desolate? Well, absolutely. You know, it is interesting that Jehovah goes on to denounce the prophets and the priests of his organization. This was Jehovah's organization that Babylon destroyed. Jehovah's temple was there in Jerusalem. The king sat on the throne there that Jehovah had appointed slaves. Yeah, get that. It says, from the least to the greatest, each one is making dishonest gain. From the prophet to the priest, each one is practicing fraud. I can tell you what a fraud is. 4 numbers, 1914. It's a fraud. It's a fraud that the Watchtower promoted this vaccine. We know they accepted money for it. A lot of religions, there were billions of dollars being passed around to promote this vaccine for the good of everyone, right? Okay. Isn't that dishonest gain? At least tell us up front. We need the money. They were going to give us $100 a head if we promoted this, so we did. Do they feel ashamed of the detestable things they have done? They feel no shame at all. They do not even know how to feel humiliated. Can you imagine Paul going to a congregation and, let's say, the Corinthian congregation? And we know they had that deplorable situation where a brother was in good standing and he was living with his father's wife. I don't know how that worked, but yeah. And Paul says, and you're not humiliated over this? Remove the wicked man. But imagine Paul going into a congregation and there's a pedophile that's been preying upon children. And in fact, he's gone to several different congregations, and the elders all kept it all hush up. They didn't want to bring reproach on God, right? On the name of Christ. What would Paul do? I think he'd fashion a whip of ropes like Jesus did. Somebody would be. That's what he's told the Corinthians. Do you want me to come to you with a whip, with a rod, or with love? So this has been hidden for a long time, but so they will fall among the fallen. When I bring punishment on them, they will stumble, says Jehovah. Remember, the faithful slave is going to be punished. The only question is to what degree. Okay, well, there's a lot there in that 6th chapter. Anyway, I think that's going to do it. I'll try to do this again next week.